Peter Bilmer also wrote in on Facebook. Apropos science educators or people who pretend to be one. A creepy YouTube atheist claims that a geological formation known as the Ashley Phosphate beds is composed of invisible layers, proving deep time. Can you address that claim?
A creepy internet atheist said that? I never said anything like that, and there's no internet atheist out there creepier than me.
Is that because every evidence for evolutionism is in fact invisible and has to be imagined?
Yeah, first of all, there's no such thing as evolutionism. It's just that reality-denying religious extremists can only think in binary terms in which they also have to assume false equivalence, as if we're both sides of the same coin, projecting all their own faults onto everyone else, as if those who accept evident reality are just another baseless faith like creationism is. But no, this is not two sides of the same coin. This is not faith versus science even. This is fact versus fantasy. And the fantasy, of course, is the one that involves the magic talking animals and the enchantments and the curses and the fairy tale endings and all of that sort of thing. We're talking about evolution, which is an aspect of biology, and this is all demonstrable. So creationists just have nonsense and lies, but that's all creationists have. If you want to see visible, verifiable evidence of evolution, ask me for it. I'll show you everything you ever need to see.
Well, thanks for writing in, Peter. The Ashley Phosphate beds are a layer of sediments which are being mined today for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and quite probably extending into Florida and up into Canada. The world-famous geologist Louis Agassiz described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds have so many fossil bones in them that it's believed the phosphate itself is from bones.
So Ian Juby is young earth creationist. He works for a ministry. He's basically a professional liar. He is paid by a ministry who is funded by people who make donations who want to have their faith affirmed. They don't care what the truth is. They want to make believe something else instead. Mm-hmm. And so they don't want to understand science because that's icky. And so they want to have somebody like Juby assure them that they're okay in believing in magic as an alternative on the excuse that nobody really knows anything.
So, if the Ashley Phosphate beds are so loaded with such incredible fossils as to cause one of the leading geologists and zoologists of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, why then has virtually zero been written about the fossils in the scientific literature?
Dr. Robert Bosenecker, you've written about the fossils in the Ashley Phosphate beds, have you not?
I've written extensively about fossils from various rock units right here in the Charleston embayment in South Carolina. I did my PhD at the University of Otago in New Zealand, studying similar fossils from New Zealand. Started here about 7 years ago. I'm a research fellow at the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History and adjunct lecturer in the geology department at College of Charleston.
When you look at what was written in the 1800s, you'll probably quickly deduce why. The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline.
He's trying to give the impression that that it's the fossil layers are only 18 inches deep throughout, from Florida into Canada, the entire East Coast, and that it includes every period of the Cenozoic, every period of the Mesozoic, all in one 18-inch layer, including humans and dinosaurs together.
And do you want me to talk about the geologic problem first? Because there's many geologic problems with those statements, and then go into the whole problems with the human remains.
Well, let's start with the many problems with the 18-inch, Florida through Canada thing, and not let's do humans after. But how do we know? Is it an 18-inch throughout uniformity, and does it include index fossils from all these different periods in both eras?
That's a difficult question to answer for a number of reasons, and it's probably because there's a number of problems with the statement in the first place. The Ashley Phosphate bed isn't a single bed. And bed means a thin layer, or sometimes a thick layer, in the rock record. The Ashley Phosphate beds, plural, are basically a mining term. So phosphate mining was very common here. It's a big boom, economic boom after the Civil War. Most of the plantations here didn't have a workforce anymore because all the slaves had been freed, and so they leased a lot of their land to mine phosphate. The phosphate is buried at a number of different depths. It tends to be concentrated on wherever you have a gap between the Oligocene age bedrock, which is typically the Ashley limestone, which is about 28 to 30 million years old, and whatever ice age rocks are on top of that. That means that the rocks on top can be different ages. So you've got some rocks that are, where the phosphate bed itself is 2 million years old. Other places it's only 120,000 years old, and in intervening places where it's 200, 500,000 years old, about 1.5 million years old, etc. So it's not a single rock layer. The other problem is that along the rivers, we had two styles of mining. We had mining on plantation grounds where they did strip mining. They would take oxen and little plows, and they'd strip away about 6 to 12 feet of overlying, usually ice age or Pleistocene sediment, get down to the phosphate layer, and then they'd carry it all off in carts, sometimes little trains, and they'd wash it off, dissolve it in acid, and then ship it off as agricultural fertilizer. The other place where there's a lot of phosphate, and this was included in the definition of the Ashley phosphate beds in the mid-19th century, river phosphate, big blocks of phosphate on the river bottom, and they would go through and dredge the rivers, and they'd often find like mammoth teeth, mastodon teeth, megalodon shark teeth, great white shark teeth, all sorts of fossils mixed together from the river bottom, and the rivers.
These are all Cenozoics.
Yes. So we're gonna get to the problem with Mesozoic material in a moment, but first, Ashley phosphate beds include land phosphate and river phosphate. River phosphate, by definition, is already material reworked from about 30 million years of different rock layers. The terrestrial or land phosphate also is the same problem. It just happens to be a discrete horizon that represents a 25 to 28 million year gap in time. So you've got multiple issues here. One, you've got Ashley phosphate beds being a mixture of river and land phosphate, and the fossils from either were commonly just called Ashley phosphate beds without any attention to this came from the river or it came from this particular quarry. None of that data exists for anything collected before 1900. Just Ashley phosphate beds, which is an area that's like probably a couple hundred square miles, to be honest. And plus or minus any information about, it might be a river specimen, it might be, in theory, a river specimen could be transported from even further upstream and be even older. Phosphate, additionally, only forms during periods of zero or negative sedimentation. Negative sedimentation means actually we're eroding sediment away. Zero sedimentation rate means there's no new sediment being deposited. The seafloor is basically just stable and accumulating material that forms there during what's called a depositional hiatus. Depositional hiatus is just a synonym. It just means there's no sedimentation going on. Sedimentation will then continue at some point afterwards. So in the Charleston area, most of the phosphate accumulated during actually about a dozen different depositional hiatuses that occur in different areas. And then the Ashley phosphate beds are basically a last phase of erosion that winnowed away all the sediment and leaving the big blocks of phosphate and the big fossils behind into what's called a lag deposit. Lag deposits are the same concept behind a gold placer. Placer deposit is where you've got gravel, all the gold goes down into the gravel, and whenever you have water, all the water transporting away the finer material, all that super duper dense gold ends up mantling the bedrock. And so placer miners would do the same thing as these phosphate miners. They dig away all the overburden and then get all the nice phosphate right from the base of the deposit. The other issue, there are no Mesozoic rocks anywhere in the South Carolina Lowcountry. You got to go inboard of I-95, which is a 2-hour drive from where I am right now, until you find any Mesozoic rocks that are anywhere close to the Earth's surface. The oldest fossils, occasionally there have been a couple of Cretaceous fossils that pop up every now and then, but we're talking like a handful. The occasional like shark tooth or chunk of ammonite shell that probably was transported by a river from the mid part of the state. Most of the fossils are Oligocene at the oldest. Oligocene is 34 to 23 million, and the age of the Ashley Formation that is underneath, and probably the Ashley is one of the major sources of phosphate for the phosphate beds in general. There's also the Chandler Bridge Formation, which is a bit patchier and thinner, has a little bit of phosphate in it, and a lot of fossil whales, dolphins, sea turtles, sharks, etc., and is another possible origin of some of the fossils from the Ashley Phosphate beds. But we also know that there are fossils in the Ashley Phosphate beds that are from another rock unit called the Mark's Head Formation, which is early Miocene. That's about 18 million years old. And then on top of that, there are Pliocene rocks in the area, the Goose Creek limestone that produces, probably the unit that great white shark teeth and some of the megalodon teeth are derived from. And then, of course, on top of all that, we've got Ice Age mammals mixed in. Mammoth, mastodon, etc. All of these have ended up in the rivers and in the deposit that's immediately overlying the Ashley phosphate beds, even in the land deposits. And in those cases, the phosphate bed happened at basically early, middle, late Ice Age. And so whatever land mammals you had living at that time, their bones and teeth ended up incorporated into the phosphate bed at the same time.
In that 18-inch thick layer, there has been found together the bones of whales, porpoises, fish, sharks, and ray sharks, including the gigantic shark Megalodon, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, tapirs, camels, elephants, rhinoceroses, mammoths and mastodons, sloths, muskrats, deer, pigs, dogs, sheep, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, what are commonly called marine dinosaurs like the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and yes, human bones, teeth, and artifacts.
Were you able to hear all that?
Yeah, unfortunately I was. Yeah, that's half that's made up. I mean, yeah, he's right about a lot of the mammals because we've got Ice Age deposits, but this is literally the first time I've ever heard anyone try to say that there are dinosaur and marine reptile fossils from the Ashley phosphate beds. Now, what he might be doing, he may be conflating Ashley phosphate beds sensu stricto with Atlantic coastal plain deposits sensu lato. And we do have a continuous blanket of shallow marine deposits that basically start in the Cretaceous and go into the early Pleistocene with some, non-marine brief interludes above sea level, but we more or less do have a continuous blanket of sediments from New Jersey to Florida, but they're all different rock layers. Just like elsewhere, the Glen Rose trackway, there's no dinosaur fossils that have been found in the same rock layer dating to the time of these fossil mammals, with the possible exception of, there's a stream deposit where all this material was reworked out and people are screening for shark teeth, like Big Brook in New Jersey, where you have a mixture of, I think, Eocene, Miocene, and Cretaceous fossils all at the same time, because the streams are cutting through rocks of those ages. They're not, it's not like you've got dinosaur teeth in a Miocene deposit. It's a modern erosional, this is an oxymoron, but modern erosional deposit. it's reworked recently, and that's more or less what we've got going on here in Charleston. Only it's 29 to about a million years.
So you're saying that the Ashley Phosphate beds, you said that's like 200 square miles.
Yeah, that's a guesstimate. Basically, the Ashley Phosphate beds are only, here's another issue, Ashley Phosphate beds are only exposed, or were only ever mapped in the Charleston region, chiefly in North Charleston and West Ashley. So not even the entire Charleston embayment, but just where these phosphate bone beds are kind of shallow. As if you're working with plows and oxen, you can't really dig down more than about 15 feet. After that point, it becomes difficult and economically unviable. So in reality, the phosphatic beds do extend further beyond that, but only in the Charleston embayment, which basically extends from like Edisto Beach to Mount Pleasant along our coastline. So about 20 miles southwest of here and maybe 10 miles northeast of here, and about 20 miles inland. And that's the entirety of the Charleston embayment.
Okay. When I try to look this up on a map, Ashley Phosphate beds, it just gives me a mattress store.
I can send along a map of the Ashley Phosphate beds from the 1930s, I think.
Okay, that would be helpful. And I tried to pull up something else, and I got an article from what is it called, the Coastal Paleontologist, and that shows a cross section of multiple strata. It's not showing me this 18-inch uniformity.
That's actually my blog.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've got an illustration there I can use.
Yeah. Those were the ones I was going to send along. So do you just use them?
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And then, so what do you say about this 18-inch uniformity that he's talking about?
Nonsense. It's not even the same thickness in different parts of North Charleston and West Ashley. Now, I think what he probably did was he's obviously been reading the works of Francis Holmes. Francis Holmes was the original curator of the first College of Charleston Natural History Museum, or College of Charleston Museum in the before the Civil War. Holmes was kicked out right after the Civil War. The museum went under, but he was a slave owner, or the polite word for that in this part of the country was planter. But he did own slaves. They probably found most of the fossils, to be honest. Francis Holmes was a good collector, but he was not a very good geologist, and he wasn't a very effective museum curator either. And so when the museum was sort of kickstarted again and eventually turned into, by the late 19th century, Charleston Museum, and the college was then bereft of a museum until Mace Brown started a new one here about 15 years ago. And this is the one I work at now. He hadn't really managed it very well. So there are a number of problems with Holmes. Holmes probably wrote about this 18-inch layer in one of several different volumes. And it was probably based on just one area that he had examined it, particularly, in good detail. But what generally happened was anytime somebody would find fossils anywhere in Charleston, they were just labeled as being from the Ashley Phosphate beds in the absence of any detailed locality data. And it wasn't until after the Second World War that many of these rock units were studied in any detail. The Ashley Formation itself was first named by actually Charles Lyell, the famous geologist in England, who in the mid-19th century sort of formalized the field of stratigraphy. He developed the field of biostratigraphy in particular. Lyell named the Cooper Marl, which is the now elevated to what's called group status. Different formations can be members of a certain group. And so we still use the Cooper group today. The Ashley Formation is one of those subunits of the Cooper Marl that Lyell named in, I think, the 1830s or 40s. Past that, everybody would just call everything Cooper Marl, and then there were Pliocene or Pleistocene layers on top. And it wasn't until the big housing boom here in Charleston in the 1960s and 70s, when we were starting to put in huge subdivisions, that better exposures were being made on land. And then we found, oh yeah, there's this new unit called the Chandler Bridge Formation, which was only discovered in like the 1980s. Actually, it was discovered in the 70s, named in the 80s. Other rock units, everything above the Ashley Formation, none of these other 4 to 10 rock units were even named until like the 1970s and 80s. So yeah, geology was still in its infancy, and the importance of good locality data had not yet been appreciated by geologists and paleontologists during the years of the Ashley Phosphate mining period.
Okay, so they had no way of distinguishing what you were talking about before with the marine deposits, which begin in the Cretaceous and would have included dinosaurs and such, but that's a different strata exposed there than some distance away, where it's now Cenozoic again. And you said that you mentioned a 28 million year gap in time, and so people watching this, you may not understand what that means. Let me offer this explanation. You have deposition and erosion happening at the same time most of the time, but one is going to be preference to the other. So there's going to be one of these that's never a complete balance. And so for a time it'll be building up, and then for other times it'll be tearing down. And then for a period you might have more erosion than you had deposition, and that's when in some parts of the world, we know what layer goes in between there because we've seen that layer appear everywhere else in the world, but here it's missing because it was eroded here.
So for example, following on from that, one of the reasons I'm here at College of Charleston is because the Charleston embayment is one of the only places where deposition was happening, marine deposition was happening during the Oligocene. And the Oligocene, again, 34 to 23, it's a period of time where we've got quite a few big sea level fluctuations owing to the setup of the circumantarctic current that results in the first major continental glaciation in Antarctica. So you have sea level fall, you have all sorts of erosion happening, one. And two, most other places in the world, deposition is happening about, the shoreline would have been about 20 to 40 miles further offshore than where it is today. So most Oligocene marine deposits are actually under the ocean still. Charleston embayment was dropping down during that time and then has since been uplifted. So we actually do have an Oligocene record here, and it's one of the only places in the world, aside from New Zealand, one spot in Australia, a couple spots in Japan, and a few spots in Eastern Europe, where you can go looking for the earliest echolocating dolphins and the earliest baleen whales. After the Oligocene, then Charleston undergoes a lot of erosion, and both sea level rise and fall can cause erosional events. Sea level rise in particular can cause a little bit of erosion. So you'll often have this record where you've got 1 million years of rock deposited, and then there's a 2 or 3 million year gap, and then another million years of rock with fossils, then a 2 to 3 million year gap. Sometimes the gap is like 10 million years. Here in Charleston, we've got 3 or 4 gaps in the rock record that are somewhere between 5 and 8 million years. And then there's a couple that are slightly shorter. But for example, we've got a gap from about 23 to 18, and then a gap from 18 million to 5 million. And then a bunch of gaps that are like 2 to 3 million years in age, above and below the Ashley limestone. The other thing that happens, fossils are some fossils are very heavy, think like megalodon teeth, elephant teeth like mastodon and mammoth. It's hard for those to be transported away. So if you've got erosion happening, one, that results in the formation of phosphate. Two, the fossils just get concentrated into what's called a bone bed. So whenever you've got fluctuating periods of time where you've got deposition followed by erosion, and it's fluctuating back and forth. That's like the perfect recipe for producing a rock record that is just chock full of huge shark teeth. That's kind of why we got so many damn megalodon teeth here in Charleston. The people from around the world come to, pick up on riverbanks, go digging up in North Charleston, Somerville, digging pits and out in the woods, or going scuba diving, which I'm too much empowered for that.
So another thing that people may be curious about is when people are when they're looking for megalodon teeth in a riverbed, they are not expecting that a megalodon was swimming in a river. There wasn't a river there then. The whole thing was under the ocean. And then after it was uplifted and it became dry land, then you have rivers that cut through strata till they get down low enough. And now you've got something that's old.
Exactly. That perfect.
All right. So you correctly guessed who it was that Juby was reading from. And he goes on and mentions a little bit more about that. And I'd like to clue you into what he says after this. So let's just play this short clip if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
That's right. Dinosaurs, mammoths, marine reptiles from the alleged dinosaur period, and humans, all found in the same layer. As many leading evolutionists have acknowledged, if humans and dinosaurs were found together, it would demonstrate that the Earth was young. It would refute the millions of years and would refute evolution. Creation would be vindicated.
Yeah, because Ian Juby thinks that if you were to disprove evolution somehow that would vindicate creationism. He doesn't understand that if evolution was disproved tomorrow, creationism was already disproved yesterday.
And that's something that a lot of paleontologists frequently forget as well. It's a very excellent point. There's a number of problems, starting with there's no dinosaurs found in Charleston. People would go crazy if there were, but I've never seen one. And I study marine mammals, so I'm not excited about dinosaurs, but you bet your ass I'd love to find one.
Juby is saying that the Ashley fossil beds run from Florida to Canada.
That's just that's a limited. Actually, it's a lack of understanding of geology, and that's pretty obviously him conflating the Ashley phosphate beds, which have a very small area and they're not even a real stratigraphic unit anyway. But let's think for a minute that it is. It's only exposed here in Charleston, so he's basically conflating the entire marine sedimentary record of the East Coast with one fossil site where mining was happening for about a 15-year period in the 19th century, which, it's absurd and sloppy.
Well, it's just what are the chances of a creationist apologist being both stupid and dishonest, right? Oh, wait, yes, that's all of them. So, sorry.
I actually generally don't think they're stupid. I think they know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, well, this guy
know what they can get away with.
I've caught him in a number of lies. I've caught him where he's correcting himself. He was going to say something truthful and then corrected himself in the middle of saying it to then get it wrong. I've seen him do that twice. I've seen him do it in this video. But I wanted to play just a little bit more. And just maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Or if you want to jump in at any point, let me know, okay?
It sounds good.
So how does this atheist answer this powerful evidence, refuting evolution and affirming a young Earth and creation? By claiming that there are layers to the Ashley phosphate beds, and that the marine dinosaurs, the mammoths, and the human fossils are actually separated into these individual layers. You just can't see the layers. Invisible layers. Good explanation.
Quick counterpoint. Those invisible layers, they're not invisible. You just got to spend more than about 8 minutes online reading the bare minimum of geology. Those layers are the Ashley phosphate bed, which is a yellow sandy limestone laid on top by the Chandler Bridge Formation, which is an olive green fossiliferous siltstone. It doesn't have any mollusks in it, like the Ashley formation does. That's on top of that is the Edisto formation, which is poorly understood because it's rarely ever exposed. It's very phosphate rich and kind of similar to the Ashley. Then we've got a greenish gray sandy limestone on top of that called the Mark's Head Formation. That's about 18 million. On top of that is a sandy light gray limestone called the Goose Creek Limestone. On top of that is the Racor Formation, which is a less calcareous sandstone that's got mollusks and vertebrates in it. And there's a bunch of Ice Age deposits on top of that, including the Waccamaw Formation, which is about 1.5 to 2 million years old, the Holloway Formation, which is about 900,000 years old, the Ladson Formation, which is about 500,000 years old, the 10 Mile Hill Beds, which are about 250,000 years old, and then the Wando Formation, which is about 120,000 years old. And each one looks different. And we've mapped each one in the field. The problem is they're not laterally extensive, so you don't see all of them in the same outcrop. And we also don't really have cliffs here, so most of this stuff you end up seeing in drill cores. Drill cores or auger holes, occasionally construction sites. You'll have maybe 3 to 4 of those exposed in any single vertical section that's more than about 15 feet thick. But the Charleston embayment is laterally very complicated. You have all sorts of lensoidal structures that you see if you do any geologic mapping at all here. It's just complicated geology, and it's, there's no invisible beds. It's admittedly, I find it confusing at times, and I get very frustrated trying to read the literature. But there are a few really keen geologists at USGS who dedicated their entire careers to carefully mapping out the geology of Charleston. And, it'll take me a long time to really get a firm hold on it. And I've been studying this stuff now for 7-8 years, and I still feel like a student. And the fact that you've got some dilettante after the barest amount of research dismissing it as invisible layers, well, that's just lazy.
This bizarre explanation gets even weirder when you consider the layer average is a whopping 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere and this layer was only 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere and this layer was only 18 inches thick.
You're not such a smart person, are you?
Professor of Geology and Paleontology, F.S. Holmes, believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence. So he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship, and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff, immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." In fact, Holmes even portrayed a dinosaur and a human on the cover of his book.
It's a minor point, but Holmes did not put a dinosaur on the cover. I think it's actually an ichthyosaur and a plesiosaur in the background. But anyway,
the picture he's showing is that of, it looks like an iguanodon skeleton, and there's a person in a museum looking at the iguanodon skeleton.
Oh, you know what? I'm looking at the wrong one. I'm looking at his. He's got this amazing illustration for the Carolina Fertilizer Company, which maybe.
Yeah, but I would also think that, anyway, that a museum patron looking at a mounted skeleton in a museum is hardly the same thing as depicting humans and dinosaurs living together.
No. And so on this Carolina Fertilizer, and it's all derive phosphate from Ashley phosphate beds. Carolina Fertilizer, it's got all these marine reptiles on the logo. So, but none of those are found here. So anyway, isn't it a little convenient that the thigh bone doesn't exist anymore? Ah, shucks. The evidence, it's like, oh, the guy who got stabbed with an icicle, and there's just a puddle of water on the floor with a dead guy. How'd it happen? There's no evidence anymore. So I'm going to follow that up with, Holmes was the most careful guy. I don't necessarily expect Holmes to have known the difference between a deer femur and a human femur. So they're about the same size, about the same proportion. And if it's true that they pulled it out of the bluff and tossed it into the river immediately, he may not have had very long to look at it. 2, I have actually gone boating along the original exposures of the Ashley phosphate beds along the Ashley River at a couple of important sites. And what you can actually see, you do see this limestone, and then you see the phosphate bed itself that's actually mantling the Ashley Formation about, 4, 5, 6 feet above the riverbed itself. And you'll find shark teeth mixed in with the land phosphate. And the limestone is hard. You would not be able to just pull a femur out of the limestone like Excalibur out of the, or sort of the stone's not Excalibur. You get the idea. You can't just pull it out of the limestone. You have to to get something 10 inches long out of the limestone, you have to spend probably about a half hour of hacking the limestone with a pick. It's not the hardest rock out there, but it's not goop. But goop is exactly what's on top of it. And goop on top of it is Ice Age and would have a mixture, Ice Age and whatever. We got this sediment that's very typically Charlestonian. It's called pluff mud. And pluff mud mantles everything in our rivers, everything in our marshes. And so what you really have, you got the limestone with this veneer of mud from the river. And then if you go up enough, there's phosphate kind of coming out of the bank. And if I've seen this happen, what I bet happened is, could have been a human bone, could have been a deer bone. Doesn't matter because we don't have the bone anymore. You also do find artifacts, Indian pottery and stuff mixed in to this stuff up on the top of the bank. And it's not Pleistocene. It's not Oligocene. It's all modern. And, nobody in the last 150 years has replicated this. And not for lack of trying, but I think it's awfully convenient that the smoking gun was tossed right into the river.
Well, then he says later that they found a human jaw with teeth, which would be much more diagnostic. But then you already said that in the same area, if you go high enough, you can find pottery and such.
Yeah, I mean, these layers are not very thick, and people have been living in the Charleston area for a very long time. And what tends to happen, I think
there are multiple layers. They're not one 18-inch thick layer that covers everything.
Yes, and on top of that, if you've got a river, it's washing away at all this, and all this stuff is just accumulating on a riverbank. It's not in its original context anymore. And Holmes was, I hate to say it, I have a lot of respect for the guy and what he did, but Holmes was enough of an idiot that I know he misattributed fossils to the wrong layers. And, he was not a very good geologist.
All right. I've got just less than a minute, I think, left of this.
The only people claiming invisible layers is creepy internet atheists. Others, like Holmes, have at least tried to explain the way the fossils found together as perhaps fossils that were worked out of older and younger rocks to be washed together. Now, this theory also just plain doesn't work, and I don't have time to get into explaining that today.
Here's the truth. The problem is not the time.
But it shows you that these experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds obviously didn't think there was multiple layers there, contrary to the ignoramuses on YouTube, who obviously don't even know how to use Google to find basic information about the Ashley phosphate beds.
Okay, so he says that the people who are using that they don't know how to do what he does. They get on Google and find that the Ashley phosphate bed runs from Florida through Canada, and that this is entirely only 18 inches deep or thick, and that it includes Mesozoic dinosaurs and all of this. I mean, because Ian Juby, he knows how to Google. He doesn't do what like say you do. I mean, what do you know? You don't know how to Google. You think there's multiple layers there.
Well, the nice thing is, in addition to what's on Google, there's also the peer-reviewed technical literature, and you got to read all of it, not just what you can find on Google. And the other thing about Google, and you probably talk about philosophy of science, is confirmation bias. You're going to find on Google whatever you already believe. So
my thought is instead of just doing the confirmation bias thing on Google, why don't I talk to someone with direct academic experience in the field?
So he makes an interesting point about, well, none of these guys who were digging in the 19th century thought there was more than one layer. Well, Lyell's Principles of Geology had not been out very long. And geology was in its infancy in the 1860s. We're talking about the American South here. It's pretty rural. The only places where rocks are really being well understood prior to 1900 is pretty much just Western Europe. It wasn't really until the 1940s, 50s, anywhere in the U.S. that a lot of rocks were subdivided into units that we would consider useful stratigraphic frameworks for modern study. So this is a very polite way of saying a lot of these people collecting fossils, doing mining in the 19th century here in Charleston didn't know their ass from their elbow when it came to stratigraphy and geology. And, and no judgment for them. Geology was in its infancy. There wasn't a whole lot to know, but also they weren't working with nice continuous vertical sections. We didn't have any of that information until, we had some sections from deep pits in, like around 1900. But we didn't have a lot of auger holes or drill cores until the mid 20th century. So it's not fair to really, talk trash about what they were doing, but at the same time, it's also not fair to hold those relatively ignorant early workers up to a higher level in current geology. We know thousands of times more about not only the rock record in general, but also the local rock record than we did 100 years ago.
And that would be why young Earth creationists can only read the literature from the 1800s.
Yes. back when they screwed stuff up, mixed all sorts of fossils together, put the wrong skull on the wrong dinosaur and the head on the tail, and did all sorts of bad mistakes like that. It is unfortunate they have to resort to taking advantage of mistakes made in the early years of paleontology in order to make a point.
That's a perfect place to end.
They do not believe very strongly in the intelligence of their followers, which is sad.
Yeah, It seems to me that people like Juby is actually counting on the lack of intelligence of his followers. Oh, yeah, well, more on the bias. They want to believe. They want to believe so bad. I've had, some believers have told me that they know that what they believe is not really true, but they're going to believe it anyway because they have an emotional need to believe it. I know that Juby himself knows better than a lot of the things he says. I know a lot of these apologists know better than what they say. They are professional liars, and very often they are also idiots, and they'll use the most ridiculous explanations because that they know how desperate their following is. The people donating money to have them lie to them want so badly to believe this thing that has been disproved, and they can just never admit that.
Right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bosenecker. You've been amazing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that we didn't cover. I think we actually covered most of it.
There's a few seconds left of this. Let me play it.
You can read more on the Ashley Phosphate beds in the book written by the late geologist John Watson, Man, Dinosaurs, and Mammals Together, available at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. Thanks for writing in, Peter.
They're always hawking something.
Yep. Men, dinosaurs, and fossils together.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, to quote one of my professors from Montana State University, where I did my undergraduate, Jack Horner, I remember, and I hate the fact that it took me into my mid-20s to really independently think of this, but I remember he gave a keynote address at a big public audience in Las Vegas in conjunction with the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference. And he looks out, he kept on apologizing because he said, look, this is normally supposed to be for a public audience. I wasn't expecting audience to mostly be other paleontologists. So, and we were like, just get on with it, Jack, whatever. But he said, what the greatest evidence in favor of evolution I can think of? And everybody in the audience is like, well, what is it, Jack? And he says, all of you. And I'm thinking, the hell does that mean? And he says, we're all competing with one another to one-up each other, get published in high-profile journals. Being able to disprove evolution would make your career and put you like literally into the textbooks forever. It would be the discovery of the century, but it hasn't happened yet. And if there was a paleontologist out there, creationists have us all wrong. We are, I hate to say it, but bloodthirsty opportunists looking for the next fantastic discovery. And you would be the most famous scientist in the world if you were able to disprove evolution or prove creationism correct. But there's a pretty damn high burden of proof for either, and nobody has ever come close to it. And the fact that, that hasn't happened yet, pretty good evidence that we're on the right track, I think.